Welcome back to Golo Nightmare. Tonight, I have a story that was never supposed to exist. A story hidden behind locked doors, missing records, and a place that shouldn't have been there at all. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Now, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and step carefully into the dark. Let's begin. I'm telling this into a phone in a parking lot, the way a man leaves a message he's not sure anyone will hear. Because this is the only place I feel like the words won't get logged somewhere. I park between two streetlights, in the overlap where they both reach, because the dark at the edges of a parking lot has started to look to me like the inside of a building I used to work in, and I don't go near it anymore. That probably sounds like the beginning of a crazy man's story. Give it an hour. I worked 9 months at a place that does not exist, and I came out of it understanding that does not exist is not the same thing as isn't there, and that the difference between those two phrases is where a person can be kept. Once you understand that, you stop sleeping the way you used to. You start parking in the overlap of the lights. My name was Russell Mead. I say was, and I know how that lands. I know it sounds like a line a writer puts in to be ominous, but it isn't ominous, it's just accurate. And accuracy is nearly the only thing I have left that I'm sure of, so I'm going to be careful with the little I've got. Before the job, I was an insurance adjuster, 12 years mostly property and casualty, working claims for a mid-size carrier out of an office park where the carpet was the color of a wet newspaper and the coffee came from a machine that took a code none of us were supposed to share, but all of us did. I was good at the work in the way that eventually ruins a certain kind of person. The job of an adjuster is to know exactly what a real loss looks like, the way a real water claim dries, the way real smoke settles into a real ceiling, the photographs a real homeowner takes in a real panic with the timestamps in the right order. And the thing about knowing precisely what real looks like is that you also come to know, without trying to exactly how to make something false wear the face of it. I could look at a claim and tell you in 90 seconds whether it was honest. That same instinct turned around will tell you how to build a dishonest one so clean that the next adjuster down the line approves it in 90 seconds and goes to lunch. For 11 years, I never turned it around. I want that on the record, not because it matters to anyone now, but because it matters to me. For 11 years, I was just a man who was good at his job and tired of his apartment. I'm not going to draw out the part about the gambling, because it's the most boring kind of ruin there is, and everyone who's been ruined that way is telling the exact same story with the same furniture in it. There was a card room out past the county line that called itself a social club. There was a number I owed that started small enough to feel like a problem I could solve with one good night, the way they always start, and then it was a number that had nothing to do with one good night anymore, a number that had its own gravity. There was a claim that crossed my desk that I knew was fraudulent, a staged thing, a man who'd burned his own garage and his own boat, and instead of flagging it, I called him, and we came to an arrangement, and I signed a report that wasn't true. One report. That's the thing nobody believes. It only took the one. After that, there was a special investigations unit, and a deposition, and a lawyer I couldn't afford, and a surrender of my license that I signed in a conference room that smelled like the same wet newspaper carpet as every other insurance office in the world. And there was my wife, Dana, who didn't leave over the money. People think it's the money. It wasn't the money. It was that I'd lied to her with the exact same skill I'd used on the claim, the same clean professional confidence, for the better part of a year. And the day she understood that the man she'd married was a man who was that good at lying was the day there stopped. Being a marriage, she didn't yell. She just looked at me the way you'd look at a photograph that turned out to be of someone else, and that was that. So when I tell you I needed a job where nobody asked questions, I need you to understand it wasn't a preference. It was a condition of staying alive in a way that felt bearable. The men I owed money to had stopped sending the polite reminders. They'd moved to the kind of texts that don't threaten you directly, that just mention things. The name of the diner where my sister Connie, waitressed, the make of her car, the fact that she worked the early shift and walked to her own car alone in the dark at the end of it. They never said they'd do anything. That's the craft of it. They just demonstrated that they knew, and they let my own imagination do the work they were too careful to put in writing. I want to talk about my sister now, early, because she turns out to be the most important person in this, and I didn't treat her like it. Connie's 2 years younger than me, and she'd bailed me out twice already, once with money she didn't have, once just by letting me sleep on her couch the week the marriage ended, not asking anything, making coffee in the morning like it was normal. And the way I repaid her was to disappear from her, because every time she called, every time I saw her name on my phone, all I could think about was the text with her diner in it and I'd convinced myself that the kindest thing I could do for her was to become a man who couldn't be found so that there'd be nothing to follow back to her. I told myself avoiding her was love. It's amazing what you can tell yourself. I let her calls go. I let weeks build up. The guilt of being unreachable became its own kind of comfort, because if I was already failing her completely, there was nothing left to protect, and a man with nothing left to protect feels something that's very close to free. That's the thing you have to hold on to while I tell you the rest. The want to disappear. It wasn't forced on me. I arrived at the gate of that place already wanting most of what it was going to do to me. I think it could smell that, I'm sure of it now. They don't hire people who want to be found. The whole apparatus is built to locate the one man in 1,000 who is already most of the way gone and to finish him gently with good records. I found the listing on one of those gig boards where the desperate go to be used. Most of the posts were day labor and delivery and the kind of thing where they pay you in promises. This one was 4 lines: overnight site attendant, storage facility outside town, work alone, cash weekly, and then no experience necessary, reliability and discretion essential. There was a phone number and no name and no address, and I remember that the absence of an address didn't strike me as strange at all, because by then an address was the enemy. An address was a thing the men I owed could find. A job with no address sounded less like a red flag and more like sanctuary. I texted the number. A man called me back inside the hour, which itself was strange that hour, like he'd been waiting with the phone in his hand. His voice was older, flat, unhurried, not unkind. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask for my name. He asked me 3 things, and the order of them is something I've gone back over more times than I can count. He asked if I had a reliable car, because the site was far out and there was no transit. Ordinary question, I said yes. He asked if I understood the word discretion, not whether I could be discreet, whether I understood the word. I said I did, and he was quiet for a second, like he was marking something down, and I had the distinct feeling I'd passed a test rather than answered a question. And then he asked the 3rd thing, in the same flat tone as the first 2, no weight on it at all. He asked whether anyone would come looking for me if I was hard to reach for a few days at a time. I heard it as consideration. I want to be honest about that, because it's the hinge the whole thing turns on. I heard a man being thoughtful about a lonely overnight schedule, checking that I wouldn't have a worried wife blowing up my phone. And I answered with something close to pride, with relief even, that no, there wasn't anyone, that I kept to myself, that I could be unreachable for as long as the job needed, and nobody would so much as notice. I gave him the answer that disqualifies a person from being missed, and I felt good giving it. That's the part I can't get past. The question that should have ended the call was the question I was happiest to answer, because I'd spent 2 years training myself to be exactly the kind of man who could answer it that way. He gave me directions, not an address, directions, the way you'd tell someone how to reach a cabin. Take the interstate out past the last exit with a gas station, then onto the frontage road that runs alongside the highway, and follow it past 3 overpasses, and after the 3rd there'd be a gravel cutoff on the right. No sign, and I'd know the place by the gate. No paperwork would be mailed. No forms to fill out. Bring nothing. Cash on Fridays. Be there at 10, he said, and hung up before I could ask anything I'd have regretted asking. There were no tax forms ever. No W-9, no I-9, no direct deposit slip, no name badge with my name on it. In 9 months, I never signed a single thing with my own hand, and at the time that felt like the kindest part of the whole arrangement. A man who has just had his name dragged through a deposition is grateful to work somewhere that never once asks him to write it down. I see now that not writing it down was the point. They were not employing Russell Meade. They were borrowing a body that didn't object to having no name on anything, and Russell Meade just happened to be inside it for a while. I drove out the first night, and I want to describe the drive, because the drive was the first thing that was wrong, and it stayed wrong identically every single night for 9 months. And the unchanging wrongness of it was worse than if it had gotten worse. The frontage road runs right alongside the highway, so the whole way out you've got the interstate on your left, that low orange wash of sodium light, headlights going somewhere, taillights going somewhere else, the ordinary river of people who are still part of the world, and then you take the gravel cutoff, and within maybe 200 feet the highway goes silent, not faint, silent, like a hand laid over a speaker. I noticed it the first night, and I stopped the car and rolled the window down to be sure, and there it was. I could see the highway, the lights, the cars sliding past in both directions a quarter-mile off, and I could not hear a single one of them, just the tick of my own engine cooling and the gravel settling and a hum I'd learned to recognize later that wasn't coming from the highway at all. It was like watching a television with the sound off in another room. knowing the picture is moving, hearing nothing. I sat there a full minute with that, the sight of the world with the volume taken out of it, and then I drove the last stretch to the gate. The building itself was nothing. This is important, and it's the thing the place does best. It was the most ordinary structure you have ever driven past and never once looked at. Long, low, windowless, corrugated metal gone the gray-brown of every industrial building on every frontage road in the country. A small front office at one end with a glass door and a fluorescent light inside that never went off. And behind the office, the rows of units stretching back into the dark metal roll doors painted that flat institutional tan, each with a number stenciled on it, each with a little hasp for a lock. From the parking area in the dark you could not tell how far back the rows went, and on the first night I had no reason to wonder, because on the first night a storage facility going back into the dark is just a storage facility. Going back into the dark. The man who trained me was named Doe. That was stitched onto his work shirt over the pocket, in red thread on a white oval patch, Doe, and I assumed at first it was a brand or a contractor's name until I noticed that the spare shirts hanging in the office closet, there were 4 of them, all said the same thing, Doe. And the shirt they gave me when I started also said Doe. I asked him about it casually that first night, said something like, "So is Doe the company?" And he looked down at his own chest like he'd forgotten what was written there, and he said, "It's easier this way." And that was the entire answer, and he said it so mildly that it took me a week to realize he hadn't actually answered. Doe trained me for one night, and I never saw him again. He was a calm man, gray, soft-spoken, somewhere past 60, and there was something about him I could only describe much later, after I understood what the place did, which is that he seemed slightly erased, not damaged, not frightened, erased, the way a pencil mark is still visible after the eraser's gone over it, the shape of it still there in the paper, just emptied of its darkness. He answered no personal questions. Not evasively, he just received them and let them go, the way water receives a stone, a small dimple and then nothing. I asked how long he'd worked there, and he said a while. I asked where he was headed after, since he was clearly training his replacement, and he smiled at that, a tired, kind smile, and said, "Same as everybody, out." And I thought he meant retirement. I don't think he meant retirement. He walked me through the job the way you'd train somebody at a gas station, and the boredom of it was the disguise. I understand that now the flat procedural boredom was the thing that let the rules slide past me without catching. "Here's the office," he said. "Here's the log." And he showed me a hardbound ledger, paper, no computer, ruled columns for date, time, unit number, and a column just labeled in and out. "You log every entry and every exit," he said. "Time and unit. That's the job. You're a logger. Some people get the idea they're a guard. You're not a guard. You're a logger." "Here's the board," he said, and he pointed at the wall behind the desk, where there was a large metal grid, maybe 4 feet square, slots arranged in rows, each slot with a little tag bearing a number, and some of the tags faintly lit from behind and some dark. "That tells you which units are occupied," he said. "You don't change the board. The board changes itself. If it's wrong, it's not wrong. It's just ahead of you. You never correct the board directly. Write it on the clipboard by the door if you have to, but you don't touch the board. Here's the master ring," he said. A heavy ring of keys that he set on the desk with a weight that seemed wrong for its size. "You walk the rows every 2 hours. You check the seals." The seals were numbered zip ties and paper tags threaded through the hasps. The kind of thing you'd see on a freight container, each printed with a number that was supposed to match a number in a book I never saw. "If a seal's intact, you note it and move on. If a seal's broken," he said, and here his voice didn't change at all, which was the unsettling part, "you log the broken seal on the clipboard by the door, the unit number, and you leave it. You do not open it. You do not look inside. Day shift handles broken seals. You never," he said, "never open a unit you didn't personally seal yourself." He said that one twice, the same flat way both times, and the repetition was the only emphasis he ever gave anything, and it was enough. "Here's the intake slot," he said, and showed me a brass mail slot set into the office wall beside the door, with a shallow drawer beneath it. "Renters drop their payments and their requests through the slot," he said. "Envelopes. You don't open the envelopes, you put them in the top drawer. Cash for you comes the same way, Fridays, in an envelope, you'll know it." He didn't mention the second drawer, the deep one beneath the shallow one, and I didn't notice it that night, and I think now that not mentioning it was deliberate, that you're not supposed to know about the deep drawer until the deep drawer has reason to open for you. And then he told me the rule about the renters, and he told it to me while he was already putting his coat on by the glass door, half out of it, the way you'd tell someone to lock up. He said, "Renters come at night. Most of them before 2. You log them, they do their business. You log them out, that's all ordinary. And then he said, if a renter comes after 2, they're not a renter. You log them all the same. You give them what they came for, and you do not engage. I asked what that meant, what they came for, how I'd know what to give them. And he stopped with his hand on the door and looked at me with that erased kindness, and he said, you'll know, the unit tells you. I asked, the unit tells me how. And he said the only thing that night that had any weight to it at all, any pressure behind the flatness, he said, don't ever leave the office when one of them's at the slot, whatever it sounds like. You stay in the office and you let the drawer do its part. And then he opened the door, and the silence from outside came in cold and total for a second, and he walked across the gravel to a car I never heard start, and the highway lights were out there beyond him, bright and soundless, and I was alone in a building that I would much later learn appears nowhere that a person could find it. The first weeks were nothing, and I have to be fair about that because the nothing is what kept me. It was the easiest money I had ever earned, 2 entries a night, sometimes none. I did my walks, I checked seals, I read paperbacks under the fluorescent hum. I drank coffee from a machine that filled the office with the smell of scorched grounds that never quite went away, even when the machine was off. A burnt coffee smell soaked so deep into the room that I started to taste it on the drive home. And for the first time in 2 years, I relaxed, because nobody could reach me out there. My phone had no signal past the gravel cutoff. I'd checked the first night in a small panic, and then felt the panic turn over into the largest relief of my adult life. No bars, no texts, no diner mention, no car described, no number with its own gravity. For 8 hours a night, I was no one, nowhere, unreachable, safe, and I mistook that relief for peace. The place rewards the part of you that wants to vanish. It feeds it, it fattens it, and you take the feeding for kindness, because you have been hungry for it a long time. The first thing I couldn't explain was the board, and it was the board because I was a numbers man, and a numbers man notices the till that's off by a coin. I'd done enough walks to carry a rough count of occupied units in my head, and one slow night, restless, I counted properly. I walked every row with the clipboard, and the rows took longer to walk than I expected, which I filed away and didn't look at yet, and I counted sealed doors, tags in place, occupied. Then I came back and counted the lit slots on the board. The board said 109. I'd counted 114, 5 units in the building that weren't on the board. I told myself the board was just behind a sloppy old system, and I let it go for a few nights. But I couldn't really let it go because letting numbers go is the one thing I was never able to do, even at my worst, even when letting them go would have saved me. So I did it properly. Over a week, I mapped the whole building on a sheet of grid paper, every row, every door, every number. And that's where I found the first thing I could prove, the kind of wrong that lives on paper, which is the only kind I trust. The numbered doors ran 1 through 113, and then, at the very end of the longest row, the row that went back into the dark farther than the building had any right to be deep, there was one more. Door, same metal, same flat tan, same hasp, and it had no number plate, just a clean rectangle of slightly less faded paint where a plate should have been and no plate. So I had 113 numbered units plus one blank one, 114 physical doors, against a board that said 109, and the blank door was warm. I put my hand flat against it the way you'd lay your palm on a child's forehead, and it was warm faintly, a low even warmth like a wall with a furnace behind it in a building that had no furnace. That was kept cool everywhere else by some climate system I never found the source of. The hallway in front of that last door was the coldest stretch in the whole place. You could feel the temperature drop as you walked toward it, your breath wanting to show, and then the door itself was warm under your hand, and the contradiction of that, the cold air and the warm metal, was the first thing in that building that made the back of my neck do something honest. I started calling it 114 in my head, because a man needs to call a thing something to keep his thoughts in order, and I want to be plain about this. I did not open it. Rule 2. Never open a unit you didn't seal. I hadn't sealed it. It had no seal and no tag and no number. By the letter of what Doe told me, the correct procedure was to log it on the clipboard by the door as an anomaly and leave it for day shift. So that's what I did. I wrote in the clipboard's little column, last unit, longest row, no number plate, no seal, warm to touch, not on board. And I went back to the office and finished my shift and drove home through the gravel and the returning sound of the world. The next night, the clipboard had a fresh page, not my entry crossed out, gone, the whole sheet replaced, clean, and the board behind the desk now read 114. I need you to sit with that the way I had to sit with it, alone, at 3 a.m. with the burnt coffee smell and the fluorescent hum. I had written a note for a day shift I never met, and the day shift had answered it, not by correcting an error, not by leaving me a word in reply, but by quietly bringing the board into agreement with the building. The discrepancy I'd discovered wasn't a mistake they'd overlooked. It was a thing they managed, and by writing my note, I had helped them manage it. I had filed the paperwork that made 114 official. The warm, unnumbered door at the cold end of the longest row was now on the books, occupied by a renter with no number, no name, no record, and I was the clerk who'd made it real. That was the night I started looking up the facility from home in the daylight, where there was signal, because something in me had finally gotten frightened enough to want a paper trail of my own. And here I was on home ground, because pulling property and business records had been half my old job, and I knew exactly where to look and what an honest record looks like, and, more importantly, what the absence of one looks like. There was no record. I want to be precise about how completely there was none, because the completeness is the whole horror of it. The thing that took me from uneasy to afraid. The county parcel viewer showed the land the building stood on as a single undeveloped easement parcel, owned by an entity called Westbrook Holdings. Listed agricultural use, no structures of record. The satellite image attached to the parcel, and I sat looking at this for a long time, showed bare gravel and weeds in the dark line of the frontage road, and where I had stood the previous night inside 114 units under buzzing fluorescence, the image showed nothing, open ground. The business license database had no listing at that location or under that name. The utility commission had no electric account and no water account for a building that was lit and climate-controlled 365 nights a year. The road I drove had a name on the map, but the gravel cutoff after the third overpass had no name, appeared on no map I could find, and when I dropped the little street view figure onto the frontage road and tried to follow it, the car had simply never driven the cutoff. The view slid past the spot as if the turn weren't there, and the place where I turned my own car every night did not exist in the eyes of the cameras that have photographed nearly every road in the country. I followed Westbrook Holdings the way I knew how to follow a shell, and it went the way they always go, except worse, because most shells eventually bottom out in a human being who signed something. Westbrook was owned by a trust. The trust was administered by a holding company registered in one of the states that lets you keep your name off everything. That holding company's sole listed asset was its interest in another company, and that company's registered agent. The address where the law says you can serve papers on a human being who answers for the thing was the easement parcel itself, the bare gravel and weeds. The company's legal address was the empty ground the building doesn't officially stand on. It owned itself through a loop, it rented to itself, it served papers to itself at an address that is a field, and at no point anywhere in the chain was there a person you could call or sue or find. The absence wasn't sloppiness. Sloppiness leaves edges. Errors, a deed entered wrong, a name misspelled. This had no edges, it was machined. Somebody had spent real effort, real legal craft, to build a building-shaped hole in every record a person could search, and to keep it perfectly empty, year after year. And that is when the second interview question came back to me, and turned over in my stomach. Does anyone come looking for you if you're hard to reach? They weren't being considerate. They were doing intake. They were checking whether I was the kind of object that gets reported missing, and I had told them proudly that I was not, and I had passed. This is the part where a sensible man quits, and I wanted on the record that I could have. I had a car and a road and the bright silent highway right there. I drove away from the place every single morning of my own free will. The horror of it is not that it held me down. The horror is that the more I understood how thoroughly the place didn't exist, the more I wanted to stay inside it, because a place that exists on no record is the one place on earth where a hunted man cannot be found. I told myself the units were not my business. I told myself I was a logger, I logged, and I kept walking past 114 every 2 hours, my hand drawn to the warm metal in the cold air, and I told myself I wasn't checking on it. I was. The renters came at night, and before 2 they were ordinary, and it was only when I started watching the times that the floor went out from under me. Before 2, they were normal in the saddest possible way. Tired people, quiet people, the kind who rent storage units, which is to say people in the middle of something hard. A death, a divorce, a downsizing, a leaving. A woman who came twice a week and sat in her unit on a folding chair I'd see her carry in, just sat, surrounded by furniture I think had been somebody's, and left red-eyed and nodded at me and signed nothing. A young man moving boxes that were labeled in a woman's handwriting. The ordinary archaeology of other people's losses. I logged them in. I logged them out. And it was the most human thing about the place. The first after 2 renter came in my second month, at 2:40 in the morning, and I learned what dough meant. The glass door chimed. I had not heard a car. A man stepped in. and the first wrong thing was that he was wet, soaked through, water running off the hem of his coat onto the floor. On a clear, dry night, in a building where it had not rained, he didn't say hello, he didn't ask anything. He looked at me with eyes that didn't quite settle, and he said a number, 31. Just that, the way you'd give a password to a door. Every nerve I had said do not engage, which was rule 3, and which I finally understood was not advice but instruction. So I said nothing. I looked at the board, and as he said the number, the slot for 31 lit faintly from behind on its own, and I understood in that second that the board was never tracking the units at all. It was a switchboard. It lit up when a request arrived, and then I heard, beneath the shallow drawer I knew, a deeper drawer unlock itself, a soft mechanical click, no hand on it, and when I looked there was a deep drawer standing open that I had never seen open, and inside it a single sealed envelope with 31, written on it in the same flat hand that wrote everything in that place. I knew, the way you know things at that hour, that this was what he'd come for. So I slid the envelope through the intake slot, the slot that's built for renters to drop things in, except it went the other way this time, out instead of in, and the moment his fingers closed on it he stopped dripping. Just stopped. The water didn't dry. It was simply suddenly never there, the floor dry, the coat dry, as though the envelope had finished a sentence that had been left hanging. He turned and walked out, and there was no car, and I logged it, 240, unit 31, out, and I sat for a long time with the burnt coffee smell and did not move. There were more, and I'll give you a few, because the shape of them matters more than anyone. There was a woman, maybe a month later, well past 3, who came in dressed for a different season, a heavy winter coat in the dead of summer, and gave a number, 76, and waited while the drawer did its work, and took her envelope and left, and the envelope made her coat seem to lift off her. Her shoulders dropping like a weight had gone, and she walked out younger than she'd walked in, not magically, just unburdened, years lighter in her face. I'd seen her face, though. I went home and I couldn't place it, and it nagged me for days, and then I found it, in a digitized run of a local paper from years back, in an article about a woman who'd gone missing from a town 2 counties over and was never found. Same face. The article was old enough that the woman in it would have been gray by now, and the woman who'd taken envelope 76 had not been gray, and I closed the laptop and didn't sleep. There was a man who came in old, I mean genuinely elderly, stooped, a tremor in the hand that gave the number, and he stood at the slot waiting while the drawer opened, and when he took the envelope the tremor stopped, and he straightened, and by the time he reached the glass door he was a man in his 40s, walking easily, and he didn't look back, and the chime of the door was the only sound, and there had been no car. There was a night I heard a child's voice, from one of the rows, while I sat in the office during an after 2 request, and rule 3 was never leave the office during a request, and I obeyed it. God knows I obeyed it. I sat with my hands flat on the desk. A child's voice, small, saying something I couldn't make out, patient, like a kid talking to themselves in a long line. And the person at the slot collecting the envelope was a grown man with a gray jaw, and he didn't react to the voice at all. And when he had his envelope, he left, and the child's voice stopped, and I never logged the child, because there was no entry for a thing that never came through the door. There was a woman who couldn't remember her own name. She came in confused, frightened in a soft, tired way, and she stood at the desk, and I could see her trying to find words, and the only thing she had was the number 40. 40. I'm in 40. Like the number was the last handhold she had on herself, and the drawer opened, and I gave her 40, and she took it, and her face cleared, not happy, just settled, the way a record settles when the columns finally balance, and she left without telling me her name, because by then I don't think she had one to tell. And there was one near the end, a thin man who took his envelope and turned to go, and as he passed the glass door I happened to be looking at it, at the dark glass with the office reflected in it, and he didn't reflect. Everything else did, the desk, the board, the fluorescent tubes, my own pale shape at the desk, and where he walked across the glass there was just the gravel lot beyond, undisturbed, no man crossing it. And on his way out, with his hand already on the door, he said the only full sentence any after 2 renter ever said to me. He didn't say it to me. Exactly. He said it to the air, tired like an apology to no one. He said, I put too much in there, and then the chime and the silence and no car. I never opened one of those envelopes. I want that on the record above everything else, because I think it is the only reason I'm able to talk to you tonight. But I held every one of them in the half-second between drawer and slot, and they were warm, the warmth of 114, and they had a weight that was wrong for paper, a shifting weight, like something folded up very small and still settling, like a sleeping thing or a thing that had recently been alive and didn't fully know yet that it wasn't. I came to understand without ever once looking that what I was handing across that slot was not a payment and not a document. I think the units don't store objects. I think they store the parts of people that people came there to set down. Not bodies. There was never a body. Never a smell. The place was clean. Lives, records, the weight a person carries that makes them findable, that makes them count, that makes the board light up. You come in before two, an ordinary ruined person, and you set a piece of yourself into a unit and seal it, and you walk out lighter and harder to find and a little less real, and the board doesn't count you because you've arranged to stop counting. And the things that come after two are the pieces being returned, one warm envelope at a time, to whoever or whatever is finally coming back to collect them, or being kept, when the unit decides it's owed more than it's giving back. I don't know which, I never knew which. That is the truth, and I won't dress it up with an explanation I don't have, because the not knowing is the actual shape of the thing, and any explanation I gave you would be me doing the one trick I was always best at, making a false thing wear a real face. Around month 7 my own life began to thin out, and it thinned the way the log thinned, and I noticed the log first because I noticed numbers first. I'd write 3 or 4 entries in a shift, and the next night the log would show 1, or none, my own handwriting simply absent from the pages, the ink not erased but never there, the paper smooth. I told myself day shift was tearing sheets. I knew better. It was the same hand that replaced my 114 note and corrected the board to match. The place reconciles, it keeps clean books, and I was producing entries that it kept quietly balancing away, and one night I understood why, and it was the simplest and worst thing. My life was being balanced away at the same rate as my log. The threatening texts had stopped. I'd noticed it weeks earlier and let myself believe the men I owed had given up, which men like that do not do. My apartment mail had changed. Bills that used to come addressed to me started coming addressed to occupant, and then stopped coming, and I told myself the post office had finally caught up to a man who was never home. An old account I'd had for years, that I logged into to check a balance, told me the account did not exist, no record found, please verify your information. And there was no information to verify because there was no me to verify it against. And one afternoon I ran into a man I'd worked with for a decade at a hardware store, and I said his name, and he turned and looked at me with a polite blank friendliness, the look you give a stranger who seems to think they know you. And he said, "Sorry, Dewey," and I said it was nothing, wrong guy. And I left the cart in the aisle and walked out, and Connie, I had been letting her calls go for so long out of my poisoned idea of protection that I hadn't actually tried to call her in months, and one night, frightened now, properly frightened, I drove out past the gravel cutoff to where the bars came back, and I called her and the call didn't connect. Not voicemail, a tone, and a recording that the number was not in service. I tried 3 more times over 3 nights the same, and I started to understand that the thinning wasn't only taking me out of the world. It was taking the world's grip off me. It was undoing the threads one at a time, the debt, the mail, the accounts, the coworker's memory, my own sister's phone, every line that ran from me out into the world that could have been followed back to find me. And I had wanted exactly this. I had answered the second question proudly, and now the place was simply granting the wish completely, the way it grants everyone's, and the granting of it was the disappearance. And the disappearance had been the job all along. I caught my own reflection lagging once. In the glass door, late, I turned to check a sound, and the office in the glass turned a half-second behind me, my pale shape at the desk hesitating before it moved, the way the man who'd left envelope to himself hadn't reflected at all, and I understood I was somewhere on the same path he'd been on further along than I wanted to know. And the payroll told me last, the way money always tells the truth last. The Friday envelope had always had a faint pencil mark on it, not my name, just a small mark, a kind of tally, and one Friday the envelope in the deep drawer had no mark at all. Just cash in a blank envelope, in the deep drawer, the one the requests came from, not the shallow one. My pay had moved from the renter's drawer to the drawer the after 2 collections came out of, and I knew what that meant the way I'd always known what a claim meant in 90 seconds. I was no longer being paid as an employee. I was being given an envelope. I had become a unit with a balance to settle, and I knew then what the warm door at the cold end of the longest row was being kept for. 114, no number. Because numbers are for renters and I was past being a renter. Warmer every week. I'm not imagining that I checked, my hand on it every walk, and over months the warmth grew, the way a unit warms when it fills. It was being prepared. I had filed it into existence with my own clipboard note. I had built my own door, and I think I was weeks, maybe days, from a night when the board would light a slot on its own and some tired thing soaked, or stooped or nameless would come in after 2 and say a number, and the number would be mine, and the deep drawer would unlock, and whoever was on the desk by then, dough, the next white oval patch with no name on it, would slide me out through the slot folded, small and warm, and stop dripping and walk lighter into the world, and there would be no entry for it because I was already gone from the log, so I left. There is no escape in this. I want that understood because the place never once tried to stop me, and that is the whole truth of it. Doesn't trap you. It just makes leaving feel like surrendering the only safety you have. I worked a full shift, an ordinary one, 2 entries that I knew would be gone by morning. I checked the seals. I put my hand on 114 one last time in the cold, and it was warm, patient, nearly ready. And at 4 a.m, I picked up nothing, because there was nothing of mine in that office. And I walked out to the gravel lot under the silent bright highway, and I got in my car, and I drove out the cutoff. And at the exact place where the silence ends, that 200-foot threshold, where the highway sound had been cut out the very first night, the sound came back all at once. The roar of the interstate, tires and engines and wind, the ordinary thunder of people who are part of the world, slamming back into the car like a wave, and in the same instant my phone, on the seat beside me, lit up and began to buzz and buzz. And buzz, months of messages arriving all at once, a backlog of the world remembering my number, debt collectors, robocalls, a string of texts from Connie that got more frightened as they went, the last ones just asking me to please just let her know I was alive. The threats were in there too, the men I owed, the diner, the car, all of it, the entire dangerous findable world pouring back into a phone that had been silent for 9 months. I started crying on the frontage road, with the danger landing on me all at once, because every buzz was a thread the place hadn't finished cutting. Every threat was proof that I still existed enough to be threatened. And I have never in my life been so grateful to be in danger. Danger means you can be found. Danger means you're still on someone's record. The men who want to hurt me are, God help me, the proof that I am still real. I didn't go back. I called Connie from a gas station with the lights on, and she answered on the first ring and cried. And she told me she'd reported me missing 4 months earlier. That she'd gone to the police when my number stopped connecting on her end too, when I'd vanished from her phone the same way she'd vanished from mine. And that the report had gone nowhere, that they'd had no record of my last address, that the apartment had no record of a lease in my name, that it was as if the officer had told her gently, as if there'd been some mistake, and the person she was describing had never been in their system at all. She'd kept the report number written on the back of a receipt in her wallet for 4 months. That receipt, that scrap of paper with a number she'd held on to out of love, is one of the things that pulled me back. She refused to let me be unfindable. She was the thread that wouldn't cut. I'm dealing with the debts now, the slow legal way, the way I should have from the start, and it's miserable, and I'm grateful for every miserable hour of it, because each one is an hour spent existing on somebody's books. Here's why I said I was Russell. I'm not all the way back. There are pieces of me still in there, and I can feel the absence of them the way your tongue finds the gap where a tooth was pulled. There are stretches of years I can't account for that Connie has stories about and I don't. Days she describes that I'm certain were mine, and that I cannot find inside myself no matter how I reach. There are photographs. She's shown me some, where I'm standing at the edge of the frame at events I have no memory of attending, my own face looking back at me from moments that are simply not in me anymore. I think those are in a unit. I think there's a warm door at the cold end of the longest row, behind which is folded the part of me I traded, willingly, for 9 months of being impossible to find, and I think I am never getting it back, because the only way to get it back would be to drive the cutoff and stand at the slot and say my number and take the envelope. And I know now what the envelope costs and who pays it. I think if I went back and asked for my own missing years, the drawer would open, and I would get them, and the warmth of that envelope would be the warmth of 114, nearly full, and the price of taking back what's mine would be more of me than I have left to give. The math doesn't balance in my favor. It never did. I check the county parcel viewer sometimes from a public computer at the library, never my own. The land is still bare gravel and weeds, no structures of record. Westbrook Holdings, agricultural use, owned by a trust that serves its papers to an empty field. The building is still there. I have stood inside it. It is still nowhere a person can find it, which is exactly why the next person who needs it will. And there will be a next person because the listing goes back up. 4 lines overnight, site attendant, work alone, cash weekly, reliability and discretion essential, no address, just a number. And somewhere tonight a man is reading it the way I read it, hearing the no address is sanctuary and the cash is mercy and the isolation is peace. A man with debts and a marriage gone to ash and a sister whose calls he's been letting ring, because he's decided that vanishing is a kind of love. So if that's you, if you're reading those 4 lines right now, at the worst hour, and the phone number is sitting there waiting for your text, I want you to do one thing for me. They are going to ask you 3 questions, and the third one is going to sound like consideration. It is going to sound like a man being thoughtful about your schedule. Does anyone come looking for you? If you're hard to reach for a few days at a time, lie. Whatever the truth is, lie. Tell them yes. Tell them there's a sister with your missing person report number written on the back of a receipt in her wallet. Tell them there's someone who would walk into a police station and refuse to leave when the system says you were never in it. Tell yourself someone would come looking, and keep telling yourself until it's true, until you've made yourself into the one kind of person that place will not take, the kind that gets missed, because the only people it hires are the ones who answer no, and the only people who answer no are the ones already most of the way into a unit, and the warmth you'll feel through that last unnumbered door, at the cold end of the longest row, on the night you finally put your hand on it and tell yourself you're not checking on it. That warmth is the last man who thought a place that does exist was a place where nothing could find him. It found him, it didn't hurt him, it didn't have to, it just kept very clean records, and balanced him quietly away, and by the time it was finished there was no record of him anywhere at all, and the board read 1 fewer, and the listing went back up 4 lines, no address, just a number, and somebody answered it.